Should have had it before the Red Sox.
Ribbon cutting.
Thank you.
I saw the pictures. When was it exactly?
It was last Wednesday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
It was great. It was a phenomenal event. We had a great turnout. It was great having, there happened to be a class during that time. So the legislators and dignitaries had a chance to learn from the students. So that was a lot of fun.
There's a lot that legislators can learn from a typical community college student, I think.
But I enjoyed watching them educate them on
Yes,
something.
right.
So that was fun.
That was great. I saw the photos from the event pop up on my LinkedIn last night. You know, you never quite know with the feeds when the event was.
Yeah.
People comment on it.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah, this is great that we were able to kind of start that process, and we've got our largest ask out to a private foundation to handle the upper levels of that thing. So, yeah, it's exciting.
And Joe, are you still keeping up your rigorous travel schedule?
It's just this weekend I was doing Bloomberg Philanthropies City Lab with the mayors, and that was, I have only like 3-day trips now between now and Thanksgiving. I had just a ridiculous schedule. So, of course, it didn't help that I was going to these cities and staying up till 1 in the morning for all these Red Sox games.
Oh, right. I've got nothing against the Red Sox, but being from Queens, I'm a Mets fan, which means that during playoff season, I'm asleep.
Okay, I was a huge Mets fan as a child. In fact, I wanted to be Keith Hernandez when I grew up.
Really?
Yeah.
Where did you go?
New York, originally as a child in the Albany area, and then I went to college in Poughkeepsie and Manhattan after. But I had mantras to the Mets in my room, and
I sit closer to we need to stick together. There aren't that many of us.
I trade with you if you want. I know, right? I had team photos and every paraphernalia you could think had the Mets on it. So it was great. Yeah.
I already liked you. You know, the Times did one of those big data analyses of the baseball fandom, and like, is there really a Red Sox nation, and if so, what are the boundaries of it? And they analyzed Facebook data to determine who were the most popular sports teams in every zip code in the U.S. And there are only 2 sports teams that are not popular in any zip code in the U.S., including the zip code in which their ballpark is located. Those 2 teams are the Oakland A's and the New York Mets. The Yankees have more fans in the Citi Field zip code than the Mets do.
Well, I bet if you'd had some winning seasons, that would have flipped.
Yeah. They were in the World Series just a few years ago, but again, they got dispatched quite quickly by the Royals.
It's much better that than. If you were Yankees fans, I'd have to resign from the commission, and then, of course, start, I don't know, public disclosure actions against you for not disclosing you were a Yankees fan.
Wow.
Mets will, despite 86, will let you live.
I was surprised and pleased to discover when I came here that 86 was
not a big, that's,
especially after
it's more masochism for us.
He looks like a.
It was the last sad sack episode.
It's going to be interesting to see.
Okay.
Hi.
Freezing as usual.
All right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Oops.
How are you?
One of those.
Here's sort of a
problem or like not a problem. I know. We'll see. It's baseball.
Let me know how you
Not safe. It's all See you.
Yeah, you as well.
Jane.
How are you? Good to see you.
Chilly in here, huh?
Can we, yeah, it is, isn't it?
Good morning.
Yeah, just adjusted.
That's
Oh, you
okay.
did?
No, that's all right. It's kind of nice. Cool.
Oh, okay.
I didn't mean it as a complaint.
All right, good morning, everybody. Let's begin. Good
morning.
How are you?
Good morning.
Thank you for joining together today. Appreciate it. We do have a couple commissioners who will be joining us by phone, but given the light background music, I think they haven't dialed in yet. But since we have a couple of minor administrative things to take care of anyway, let's begin with that. You have in front of you copies of the minutes from our September 25th meeting. Would you like to take a moment to just quickly review them? And then I'll entertain a motion to approve them.
How do you entertain a motion? Moving.
Very carefully.
And JD, I don't know if that matters if my name is misspelled.
We'll correct that. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second? Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. This is a little bit annoying, the music in the background. Where's Andrew? Andrew, is there something, can we mute that somehow? But then I suppose we
Yeah,
don't
we
know
won't be able
when
to hear
people
it.
join, right?
We can turn the volume down.
Okay, all right. That's bad. Let me begin by just giving you a sense of what has transpired over the last month before we go into some discussion of the recommendations that are before you. I'd say about 90% of the time the team has spent on this commission in the last month has focused on conversations with Secretary Acosta and Secretary Pizer and ultimately the governor. And I thought I'd begin by giving you a sense of that. The part of the funny thing about commissions like these is that you're asked to give the governor a set of recommendations, but you don't really want to provide anything that you think the governor will not find useful or productive. And so a lot of the internal discussion circled around that. We collected a broad set of ideas, largely drawn from our summer discussions, and as I think you probably perceived from the list of recommendations, many of those ideas have made it into the draft report. Some did not, and that was a result of the vetting process that we went through. So I would say that the team and I had a couple deep conversations with each of those two secretaries individually. We had two substantive conversations with the two secretaries and their senior members. And then on one of the regularly scheduled cabinet calls with the governor, the two secretaries presented a set of ideas. So that's been the process. And from that, these funding recommendations and policy and program recommendations are what stand. So let me just walk through, before I go into that, let me say this. We are still very much in the process of revising the larger report text. We're not anywhere near finished with incorporating some of the feedback that we heard from last time. I personally think we can take the report text to the next level, particularly around creating a much clearer through line of argument that leads into the recommendations and findings. And so we will continue to work on that. But what was very necessary this past month was to socialize within the administration the ideas that we have been circulating and to get as clear a sense as we could of what will fly and what did not. So more to come on the full report. So let me just walk through the recommendations, And along the way, I'll try to provide some insight into how we got to certain places, and explain some things that you may not be familiar with. What do we got? Yeah. This always seems to happen.
I like you with background music.
It softens the edges.
It does. It does. It's just thematic.
Recommend this to your wife.
I need more than that.
Hey, John. John. Where's the presentation?
It's on the desktop.
Is this it? The LO?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I'm grateful it's not Sousa or something.
Yeah, really. You know what we can do? Why don't you take it offline, and could you get on the line and just stay on to see if someone joins, and then we can dial in when someone's actually on the line.
Excuse me, just a minute.
Thank you. Okay. So, again, many of these concepts we've been talking about for months now, but the recommendation number one has been to have a lifelong learning ecosystem enabler. I know we've used many terms over the course of our discussions, but this is the one that seems to resonate the most within the administration, and I would say particularly Secretary Pizer, for the following reasons. There does seem to be a core goal here seems to be ecosystem development, right? So having that in the title of this is good. And, you know, very much along the lines of what we've talked about previously, not having a regulator, not even having something that points at, you know, a directive activity, enabler seems to be the most gentle articulation of this. The new idea that you see here is that this enabler might be modeled after the statewide STEM Council. And let me tell you where that idea came from. That came from the governor in the conversation that the two secretaries had with him. And are any of you familiar with the statewide STEM Council? Are you on it maybe? It's a
familiar with it.
it's a body that's was brought into existence by state statute. It consists of elected officials, business leaders, governmental officials, and all the relevant stakeholders in the STEM world. And it is charged broadly with being an interface between STEM employers and STEM industries, and largely the K-12 and post-secondary education systems in Massachusetts. And you know, it leads to things like the statewide STEM Week that the Commonwealth had last week, as well as broad directions around policy and programs and initiatives that the education system might undertake. And so apparently the thinking was that construct, which is a big tent construct, would be a helpful way to set up an enabling entity. That Big Tent construct remains important in our work because part of our dynamic here has been wanting to, move forward in a way that leaves the door open for people to participate, and having the enabler be a place where lots of different types of people can participate is seen as something that will help promote that. So that's where that idea comes from. And then the specific activities, we did a little bit of modification from what was in the report last time, but you'll see it's largely around convening, analysis, helping to create common understandings and things like that. Any questions on that construct?
I was wondering who actually staffs the STEM Council. I'm not clear. I've been to their meetings, spoke a couple of times, but I'm not sure who is the working behind it?
It's effectively the Executive Office of Education.
Of education, it is, okay.
And so what's left unspoken in our draft,
Not
but is
yet.
very much an issue, is who would be the staffing entity for this if this becomes the construct. I think the going assumption is that it would be Commonwealth Corporation, but that has not been articulated publicly.
Well, I know you and I have spoken a couple of times, and that just throughout this whole piece, particularly this piece, I think it's important to somehow, if it's possible, to add a line or language in that to say, coordinate with regional activity going on in this vein somehow. Because regionally, a lot of this is being done through workforce boards, community colleges, tech schools, etc. But it's not being done as we need it on a statewide level. So I think somehow some language maybe could be added to that effect.
I think it's worth spending a moment now articulating some of the stakeholders who we think should be stated in
Yes,
the
right,
report.
right.
So I love that suggestion and would love to hear others. Because from here, we will now add some meat to this. So what are your thoughts of categories of entities that should definitely be mentioned in the context of this enabler?
I was actually thinking about something else, which will may be unhelpful, but I was just trying to think of some other states that might have some bodies we could look at that are equivalent. I think the Bell Commission in Colorado is an ongoing one, and certainly they have been very aggressive in things like work-based learning, and I think, generally speaking, Governor Hickenlooper's had a very effective integrated program. So we may want to, and there may be some other people know some other states we could look for in terms of both how they chartered it and what the membership was.
Okay, that's great. Other thoughts? Mike, would you have something?
I had a thought, not maybe it's not along the line of the question you asked, but it seems to be there are very different functions there. One is funding, grant making, etc. One is convening, and one is program or content creation, such as pathways, taxonomies, etc. The conference is convening. Your suggestion is convening.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very different animals, right? I mean, you have different types of activities, different responsibilities, different outputs.
Yep.
So first of all, I would suggest calling those different categories out.
Okay. What were the words you used again?
The convening, but one is sort of content / pathway creation, I don't know, maybe something like that, because the taxonomy is actually an intellectual activity which has an output. A pathway is an intellectual activity which has an output.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is grant, program awards, etc. And there may be others. So anyway, I was just going to say, one is I would suggest categorizing them, but I also think because they're such different animals, you need different organizational structures. So really talking about 3 different sub-organizations within one organization here.
Yeah, it may be, and you can easily see along the lines of what you just said, what activities are most appropriately broadly informed by this type of structure, and where the real work falls to the organization that's backing it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to add to Mary's point about the regional planning efforts, and part of what the Workforce Skills Cabinet has put a lot of effort into the last several years is having all of the workforce boards, the 16 regions, kind of roll up into these 7 more super regions, if you will, and do a lot. There's been a lot of coordination and creation of blueprints, analyzing labor market data, and developing priorities that are germane to large swaths of the Commonwealth. And so to the extent that there's convening, coordinating employers, a lot of the activities happening at the Mass Hire boards. And so I think calling out an alignment to that in some way would be important. Because there's already an existing mechanism, these regional teams that already include the workforce system, the education system, as well as the economic development side of things. So our regional planning agencies have been involved, regional economic development organizations have all been brought to the table. And so there's a critical mass of people and links to employers, et cetera, that there's a structure that's there that we can link to.
Great. I mean, I appreciate that very much. And so, you know, the workforce boards, public post-secondary institutions, private post-secondary institutions, training organizations, economic development, regional planning organizations, and probably several more are sort of obvious
I think-
players. in this. Of course, employers.
Secondary.
Yeah.
Well, I think the hardest piece that you're going to have to integrate into this, but that's critical if you're doing this kind of convening, is how are you going to get the right entrepreneurs in there? Like, how do you get the right alternative learning providers out there? Because it's critical to have the traditional post-secondary institutions, but if we're talking about a lifelong learning system, there are hundreds of companies working in this space. And so you almost need like a couple of folks who lead like the Employment Tech Fund or venture capitalists who've seen all the solutions out there in the workforce tech space, so that they can help you figure out how to suss out some of the folks out there. Like, I just actually saw a group called Tectonic. They're the first IT-based apprenticeship program that's DOL registered as an apprenticeship now. It's like one of the only ones out there. You need someone to be able to like give you those options too as part of that marketplace.
Yeah, that's great, the entrepreneur
Yeah.
space.
Most of them aren't very good, by the way.
Some are good.
Some are good, but most aren't.
That also link to the credentialing bodies. So like in my world, it would be maybe like NIMS or like the National Institute of Metalworking Skills, or like we have a strong chapter of the Boston Tooling and Machining Association. They might be able to bridge the gap of what you're talking about, and they have their key employers that already have those relationships, and if they're at the table, then the employer buy-in might be a little bit more palatable. Or
I would add SME, the Society of
Yeah,
Manufacturing
yeah.
Engineers, ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, et cetera, et cetera. There's
Yeah.
a huge outreach and a lot of benefit from that.
Yeah, do you have another tech organizations that EOLWD is working with right now is called Apprenti,
Yeah.
and it's an IT, very similar to what you're saying, apprenticeship
Portion-based.
program that has done a lot of work in Washington State and others, so they would be a good group. I think you're right. There needs to be the people who really know how to do it.
That's a really good point. We've been engaged them as partners. And they're helping the state as well as the federal government, looking specifically at the apprentice programs related to IT, cybersecurity, that sort of.
Great. Hi, Pat, how are you?
I'm well. Is this JJ?
Yes, sorry, we had a bit of trouble connecting you there. Welcome.
Yeah, no problem.
We're just going over, hopefully you were sent the PowerPoint presentation.
I do. I have that, yeah.
We're just on recommendation 1 and talking through how to further articulate sort of core stakeholders in
Okay.
this enabler.
Judy, to Michelle's point, if you do have need for someone to provide insight around the tech entrepreneurial space, if someone shared the specifics of what we're looking for, I would have a particular expertise in that area and would be happy to help.
Do you all have a thought as to, I mean, obviously we've talked for a long time now about scoping this to launch with healthcare, but do you have a thought about whether we should include just healthcare as a substantive focus of this larger enabler, or whether we ought to bring in at least IT and manufacturing, the two other key industries we've talked about along the way?
I think it should be broader.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing to simplify this, if you need it, the last one in particular kind of struck me as odd when I read it. Just I understand kind of the desire there, but instead of adding another, that's a huge task to build like a national conference around this. You could just, if you could even have Governor Baker speak on this commission, speak about this commission at both Learn Launch and ASU GSV. And we're very connected with the people who run those. That would be a very simple way to do it instead of trying to convene your own national conference. There's so many conferences out there.
Happy to tell you where that comes from. So this is an interest of Secretary Piser's, and actually along the lines of what you said. I think some of the thinking is Learn Launch has become here a bigger and bigger thing each year, and that there might be a way to partner with them as opposed to create a new, different thing.
Do you want some additional specific?
Yes.
Two, I would say, is on the analyzed labor market data, I would love to see this enabler disseminate data and disseminate the analysis that is performed on that data, rather than just analyze it and come to findings. So, as an illustration, would this enabler fund community colleges getting significant access to the commercial data out there about job postings? A second, which is implicit in the organized national conference, we'll hope that we have enough success to begin to warrant a steady queue of visitors to want to know what's going on in Massachusetts. But being a bit of a receptor for incoming, but also having a specific mandate to understand what's going on elsewhere. There's a lot of innovation going on here. I mentioned what's going on in Colorado, which I think right now is probably the trendsetter, but we mentioned Apprendi and in Washington how they're aligning an industry cluster there with the state. There's a lot going on in Colorado that I think, in Washington State, that I think suggests the wheels are going to come off, but that's just a judgment on my part. But this is a body eventually that should have someone who can talk about
An evangelist.
Yes, and also just be knowledgeable when a foreign company is coming to Massachusetts saying, what could I do relative to my employment model worldwide is based on the accessibility of work-based learning apprenticeships. How does that work in Massachusetts? And know what the Swiss model looks like, know what the German model looks like, know what the Singaporean model looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Great, thank you for that.
I'm also wondering if there should be something in there about, from an innovation perspective or think tank perspective, there's this reads to be a lot of, sort of working with the existing elements, some of which, there might be some innovative ideas, but I think when we talk about bringing the state to another level, the opportunity of, having them play a role, as a part think tank or a collector of, innovative concepts beyond our state to bring in would be beneficial as well.
I'm sort of picking up that we need to, that there's an interest here in emphasizing the innovation entrepreneurship zone in this.
I think a really, I've been thinking about the STEM Council thing, and I think at some level, a report like this probably shouldn't and can't get too operational. But I do think we're probably all intrigued. I spoke briefly about like what does one mean when say like the STEM Council, and some of us have some exposure. I have a little bit, but I don't quite know. One thing I do think is I've not always been a fan of this term STEM, and STEM takes place in the context of an existing school system. Mostly people talk about it in K-12. There's other a lot of higher ed too, but right. But give the people who are behind STEM credit. That term, there's not a person in this room who doesn't think they know what it means, kind of, sort of, who hasn't been involved, where it hasn't affected some thinking, right? So one of the analogies to me is simply this lifelong learning point. What is the lifelong learning? Lifelong learning itself has no single advocate. So arguably STEM Council and players like that can only succeed if STEM grows and evolves and shifts within an existing ecosystem, right? And that's kind of the same point. So to me, I would put the priority on this notion that who is the single advocate for the idea that lifelong learning has to become real, right? Because there was STEM, there's some science, lots of math, maybe a little bit of technology and engineering happening, maybe kind of in school, right? It wasn't that there was none, and no one's saying, well, rip it out and have separate, or a few people are, but mostly people are not saying, right? But take it out. But they are saying it has to be really it has to gain an independence of vision and support at so many different levels. And I think that's the same idea here. That's why I think it's a pretty good analogy. And so part of the STEM Council is that strong, highly visible. I think the co-chairs of the STEM Council are the CEO of Vertex, Congressman Kennedy, and Lieutenant Governor. Right? I believe those are the Both. That's meant to provide a lot of visibility, right, to STEM. That's not that necessarily, right?
That's exactly right.
In a different way than an agency is suddenly responsible for lifelong learning, whatever one it is, and then all the other agencies and everybody else goes back to silos and.
Right. I mean, I'm reading into the conversations I wasn't a part of here a little, but I think that's a main driver behind this idea.
And I think it's a powerful idea, because lifelong learning, it's a cliche that has relatively little reality. Right? That's the problem, right? It's like, that was the STEM idea. I think it's like, well, they're allied fields, they matter, everyone says we're doing it, but no, you're not really doing it, right? Not enough, not well enough,
I think that's particularly important also because we actually have a pretty good grasp of a lot of the things that work. We need to do them a lot better, but work for young people entering the workforce. We know pathways programs work. We know respecting and publicizing credentials and certificates that lead to very household sustaining incomes, as opposed to always celebrating the 4-year degree, that's important. But when you start getting to that displaced worker, that person that is coming out of the criminal justice system, somebody that some college, no degree, stuck in a low-paying job, we don't have. We say lifelong learning, but we know, for example, a lot of people in those populations don't want to go back to school, are intimidated by it, have all the things we mentioned in the report about other obligations that make it very, very difficult for them to suspend their lives while they get re-credentialed. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation there, and if we could become the state that understood the lifelong part, the initial post-secondary education, whatever it is part, that'd be great.
Well, it's just interesting. I mean, there's what I'm hearing is, there's multiple roles, and it's all in formation at the same time. So you want the evangelist, but you want the evangelist at a time when the thing is still needing to be further defined. What sort of how I was processing this conversation is, this body is, in turns, the evangelist. It also helps develop the identity of lifelong learning as a concept. It provides, and it provides some leads into how practically to do it. And there are some things that we're discussing, by the way, that are not part of the remit of the STEM Council today. I mean, the stuff about, content and pathways and grant program awards, that's not stuff that the council does. And I think that's helpful to be able for us to be able to articulate, these categories of activities, instead of just saying, we're going to have a STEM council like Lifelong Learning Board, and the next group of people will figure out how to do it. So this is great. Alex.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Chris was saying, what I think is also important is the applicability of the lifelong learning to the actual business. So that connectivity to the business line is really important. At Partners and many other organizations, you do have lifelong learning. You have career tracks. You have sort of embedded into the daily work. And to your point, Joe, that folks can't really take off and go back to an academic institution. And so we try to support them through some sort of certifications, or because we're evolving, they need to evolve with us. And so really the connectivity between the education, how it's applied to the day-to-day is really important. And then those employers, maybe like the ones you mentioned, that see the investment in continuous learning. I think that really, it's part of the budgeting. it's part of the benefits, it's part of all of that. It's not separate, it's incorporated.
I don't want to, I certainly heard what you said about there's been some socialization discussion about what's on the table and what can't be or shouldn't be, but the mechanisms that provide encouragement or incentives for employers to invest in that type of upskilling of their incumbent workforce as opposed to playing the spot market and or accommodating students in work-based learning settings to kind of catalyze receptivity to that would be something I'd be enthusiastic about if there were an audience for it
I'm also wondering,
for the decision makers.
lifelong learning is such a broad label that perhaps what this entity would do is to be able to, like STEM, STEM has 4 components, right? It's an acronym. Maybe this group would define, what are the 4 legs of lifelong learning that we want to prioritize in the state, and then focus on branding those and dividing those to accomplish that work. Because I think that lifelong learning itself might be very difficult to sort of brand with a specific entity when it has so many meanings today, but it can be a great umbrella term like STEM.
I love how the arts people try to get in to make it STEAM.
Yeah.
So maybe they have to like lifelong learning or something.
But that'll come eventually, sure.
JD, you mentioned making the storyline, refining the storyline. I thought the longer recommendation that relates to creating pathways for learners, the applicability of that, particularly in grades 9 through 12, kind of jumps up in the recommendation section, but isn't really presaged in the text.
Is there a role for this enabler, kind of from an infrastructure perspective, right? So I don't know whether it's transcripting or it's supporting the website that people go to for PLA assessment, or did you envision a role for that, or is that kind of off the table as well?
I mean, it's not off the table per se, but that specific idea hasn't been incorporated into the discourse, either that I've been a part of or what I've understood other discourse to be. So it's mostly in the broad direction setting space, but there is this as yet undefined body of work that the backing entity does, and maybe that's part of what the backing entity does.
Well, I just keep thinking, if you are an incumbent worker, need to be reskilled, just to make a very simple case here, it's how do you even begin to start to learn how do I do that, right? Where do you go? How do you go to think about maybe some credit you already had, or who offers this that could be received for that particular, right? So it's like, just where do you start the journey? And it seems like there's marketing around that, but there's a platform thing there.
So I think that gets to the mass experience counts piece that we get to a little bit later. But that's a great thought.
But and theoretically, that's where you go to the One-Stop Career Center. I mean, that's the retail arm, so to speak, of learning. I'm not necessarily saying it's perfect, but that is the theory. And there are platforms within the One-Stop that leads you to this sort of work. That's my, people say I don't know where to go, I say go to your One-Stop. That's where you can start the research. And you can access resources, and you can access lists of education and training programs, and you can access workshops, and you can access that whole ecosystem, so to speak, that gets you on your way to make those changes that you need to make. Again, most people show up at the One-Stop and say, I just want a job. They usually say that, just get me a job. And then we say, well, we can get you this job, but if you want a good job, Can I send you to school, learn to be a machinist, and then we can get you into an apprenticeship and into a better situation. And then it becomes a little negotiation with the job seeker. But
I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, Marjorie, and that's one of the things that I was looking for. You're right, the mass hire in general should definitely be the place that people go. I think the challenge right now is that, for the most part, it requires for someone to walk in there. And
that's true.
For me, I'm a tech guy, so maybe I'm a little biased, but the idea that I'm going to walk in anywhere to receive anything just boggles my mind.
Right.
And I think that without that platform there and available, it just seems that we're trying to proliferate the same type of brick and mortar platforms that are not skilled.
No, we do have people from all over the country who get on JobQuest and sign up and become members of a Massachusetts One-Stop Career Center, Mass Hire. But I agree, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really make it what you're envisioning.
Yeah.
It really needs work.
Because anyone's going to go on there and Google, how do I get a better job in law, right? And the winner is going to be the winner of the search engine optimization. It's not going to be the platform that they need in Massachusetts to really advance themselves. So I think it's a critical piece of what the back end entity does. I mean, it was the core of what we had that whole summer discussion. Like I think it was us three talking about it. But I think it's critical. Otherwise, we can't create the right sort of marketplace effect within Massachusetts.
And I agree very much with this idea that we need to have a robust virtual infrastructure to match the face-to-face services. But I will say that there's a whole population of people in Massachusetts whose first instinct is not to Google. There's a big digital divide when you talk about the economically disadvantaged communities that we're talking about, the lack of technology and technology literacy that isn't their first instinct. So, I just want to be mindful when we're talking about the broad constituents that we're serving, that there are a lot of people who their first instinct will be to talk to their cousin or their neighbor or something, as opposed to getting online somewhere.
So, but also, as the training providers and the people that are on the support system also have to help bridge that gap too, because like when I'm working with Mary's mass hire people, I have to, as a training provider, also have to guide them through the mass hire department too. So I have to, almost be the liaison for that person or that advocate for the student that wants to get those certificates or certification. So not only are you educating them about the industry and what the career pathways are and the kind of the learning process, but you also have to help them guide along with the Career Center, because they might have English as second language issues, or you're talking with their daughter who's 15 that speaks speaks English and interpreting for them. So there are all these kind of facets that are exactly what you're talking about, and when they try to go online and do like a search, it becomes a real challenge for them.
So what percentage is that, right? That don't have any sort of digital literacy? Because even I've got a number of family members that they may not be very proficient on Google, for example, but they're most certainly avid users on Facebook and other platforms. So I think that despite, and believe me, I'm very passionate about making sure that we're servicing underserved communities. But I think there has to be as we think about building something for the long term, we have to figure out how we're going to get these people up to speed, and it has to be based on the majority, because there's always going to be a certain pocket that does have that digital divide, that doesn't have computer literacy. But I can't think of something that we're designing in 2018 thinking about someone who doesn't have that proficiency. Rather, I would say, who are those people? What percentages are those people? And how, as part of this program, we develop a very strong, very targeted digital literacy initiative so we can make sure that they can participate.
So just to put a little bit, very briefly, into perspective, I'm on the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, and I come with a tech background, and I'm a big believer in technology, but certainly working in Western Massachusetts has illuminated for me some of the challenges with these underserved communities. Up until just a few years ago, there were 41 communities in the state of Massachusetts that didn't even have high-speed internet. I mean, so, they haven't had the infrastructure to be able to develop all the other things in terms of access. So I think perhaps what I'm suggesting, because I do believe that we ultimately have to prepare these same learners for a more digitally enabled future, is that we take into consideration how we can not reinforce the digital divide, but perhaps help reduce it or eliminate it through the solutions and the approach to this.
Sanjay, and then let me try to move us along. But I have a thought about how we might talk about this.
Very quickly, I'm reminded of in healthcare, if you have an emergency, you end up in the ER as opposed to preventative. You sort of take care of yourself, you take your vitamins, etc. One of the challenges, I think, in the workplace is people's jobs are going to be impacted by technology and they don't know it. And so there's that lack of visibility. For example, I'll give you an example, welding. As you go from a low heat flux to a higher heat flux welding system, it becomes too powerful for a human being to handle. It's going to get roboticized. So just being aware of where your job is going or not going is something that I think we need to look into. In fact, I wrote an editorial about this at the National Academies Press called a Job Navigator. I'm not sure how to do it, but just by scraping LinkedIn pages, etc., there's a whole interesting sort of avenue to pursue. And that's what people who have jobs now who would get ahead of the game, but are slipping. And then, of course, we have the ER situation. The other comment I would just want to make to get us moving on is, I would suggest when we finish the recommendations to define 10 personas and test them against the recommendations.
That's a good idea.
Just when I thought I had the work under control.
Actually, no, I would.
This is easy to do, actually.
I'd add to that. I think you need a multi-layered marketing approach depending on the audiences you're going after. Those are personas. For example, you may have frontline workers that corporation can effectively market what the path would be. I think corporate employers are a big part of this as well. They actually communicate where people can go. So I think you do need a multi-layered persona approach.
So thank you for this. It's a very important discussion. It seems to me that we ought to have some space within this recommendation that speaks about the potential need for a starting place for learners, to talk about the online manifestation of that, but also readily acknowledge the digital divide and speak about how existing pieces of the physical and human infrastructure of our system might be put to use so that people don't continue to be left out. I mean, after all, our whole effort is motivated by a recognition that people are getting left out of the education and training systems that we have today. So I'm glad we record these things because I often go back and listen to the discussion, and I'm going to listen to this discussion and try to reflect carefully what I've been hearing. I'll just say that in conversations with Secretary Acosta and Pizer and others, this notion of some kind of portal or platform has come up. As you see later in these recommendations, there has been some thinking that the mass experience counts portal, which is a sort of rudimentary, but it's there, is something that could be developed. Commonwealth Corporation is developing something in the context of our workforce training fund that's really kind of a training marketplace. There might be something there that could be developed. We don't need to make those choices today, but we would. It seems that we would do well to capture this theme better in the final report. So we'll attempt to do that. Great. Let me move on and go to the challenge grant, which again is an item that we've talked about before. I think that So again, this is just a concept that has now been put before the governor. I can't say, that he said, yes, we're going to do this, but I can say that there's been discussion about it. I can say that it's the administration's point of view that this report should refrain from attaching monetary figures to things, because that's seen as more of a constraint than a help. But internally, we certainly have thrown some numbers around, and the idea would be to have it be robust enough so that you could actually get a number of initiatives going across regions of the state, all at once in the next year or two. So that suggests a certain size. Of course, there are lots of things that the governor may choose to put in his budget that don't get funded by the legislature. So there's that piece of it, which is why we've also tried to think about existing funding streams that could be utilized. But this, I think, reflects things we've discussed before, a focus of the Challenge Grant Program in developing digitally enabled lifelong learning competency-based programs in healthcare, sort of explicit alignment with the regional skills blueprints. I know some of us around the table have gone in and looked at them, but they give you a good read on what each region of the state thinks are going to be the growth areas, and almost always they're within healthcare, because healthcare is either the top or second most important growth area in every region of the state. So you can go in, and we've done this and created lists of jobs that will be growth areas in North Central and the South Coast and out west, et cetera. And so we'd want the any RFP process attached to the Challenge Grant Program to be done with reference to those jobs that have been identified. In keeping with the big tent kind of thing, the thinking is that a broad array of education and training providers would be eligible entities for such a Challenge Grant Program. That includes public 2-year and 4-year institutions, private 4-year and private institutions, training providers who are not institutions of higher education, and entities that are in the education and training entrepreneur space. And then the thinking is that a consortium model would be appropriate. So the way this would come together would be that consortia of employers, providers, and other relevant partners would put together an application relevant with reference to a specific job need, healthcare job need in a specific region. One structure that is in formation that may be useful for this is the Healthcare Skills Collaborative. That is a effort that has come out of work that the administration has been doing with Boston Consulting Group around how to accelerate the closure of skills gaps. So BCG did this analysis over like a year, and they did extensive analysis, and came to the conclusion that if Massachusetts really wanted to make a dent, they should focus on healthcare first, and there's all sorts of data that undergirds that. The Healthcare Skills Collaborative is meant to be a kind of a subboard, if you will, thinking about this. If you have in mind our enabling entity, the Healthcare Skills Collaborative would be a board of healthcare company CEOs, hospital CEOs, and their key workforce people who would provide input into the overall design. So how do we really get to the level of detail and refinement that we would want in this? And then if we run a successful Challenge Grant Program on healthcare, we would then expand to advanced manufacturing and IT.
So it's specifically healthcare distribution, not life sciences more broadly?
It's it's healthcare broadly construed, I think, and more with reference to the jobs that are the growth jobs than anything else, right? So if those tended to be more life sciencey in a particular region, that would be the appropriate set of jobs. If
Maybe
they
if I
tend,
could add that to
yeah.
it. One, if it's the same one, that's through MACP, and one of the buckets that they're looking at, the folks that fall within 30 to 70,000, and how do we upskill that community so that they can really make a living wage in this area. So that's also a factor in the jobs. Many folks fall into that. Entry level, they get stuck there.
Right.
It's interesting that you would want to collaborate. I think it's great. I think it's obviously, they've done some good work with data there.
And there's no STEM council equivalent for healthcare in the Commonwealth?
Not that I know of. I mean, there are things that have existed over the years, but I don't know. Do any of my colleagues know about healthcare that exists now?
I know there's always arguments about whether healthcare is STEM or not. Because when we're asked to look at STEM jobs in our area, I have a tendency to draw healthcare jobs in, because to me they seem like STEM jobs. So that's an argument that goes around and around, because the scientists say we're just looking for pure science, and we know there's nothing more scientific than being a nurse or an occupational therapist or whatever, or doctor or whatever it might be. So I always think of healthcare as being part of the STEM council, to be honest with you. But
JP, one observation, just thinking about these kinds of skill development programs. One, the wraparound services that are going to be needed to them in order for them to really provide the necessary support, particularly as you think about underserved communities. That's going to be huge, and historically it's one of the key things that I've seen missing in other initiatives. And then the other piece is, from an outbound marketing perspective, how are we connecting with these communities? How are we connecting with communities in Springfield, Holyoke, and Chelsea, Lawrence? Historically, these communities don't have participation in these programs, and part of it is because they don't know that they exist, and that there is very little engagement with the local leaders, not just the mayor, but I mean the people in the weeds.
I think your comment around support services is very much why there is a desire to have a consortium-based model, that community providers, student support providers would be part of the consortium. And while you're right that we would need to think in more nuanced terms about how to reach communities that often get left out, the broad thrust for a regional, to give grants to different regions, right? And the outreach effort that would be associated with that is part of the thinking. But could you offer a suggestion into how we might add some thinking here and words in the report around how best to do that outreach?
I think you need to call out Latinos and African Americans specifically. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's 2 Latinos in this room, and what percentage of the population do we represent in the Commonwealth? That's emblematic of the issue.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I really like the idea of a challenge grant program. The one suggestion I would make is I don't know if it's worth putting in the recommendations or just to have it as background, but it's worth reaching out to the experts who do this kind of work, like X Prize and other sorts of these kinds of challenge grant entities, because they have a lot of lessons on how you actually create milestones so that when you do this thing, the people who are moving forward to access that big prize money are actually, it's not just concept, it's not just vaporware. They're actually, there's a there. So I think that's really critical, because I think a lot of folks in that space know precisely how to tier the phases so that it's really effective. The other piece that connects the earlier recommendation with this one, that that it connects to what Sanjay was talking about, but this idea of an education GPS, and Michael Horn has written about this too, and it's this idea of like, what is that function in which you get some good advice, you are understanding what's out there, how do you curate the learning out there to move you forward. It might be also worth thinking about a challenge grant thing for career pathing tools that already are out there, so you can kind of test to see, does it work with the specific instantiation that you're talking about? Because there are really interesting tools out there already. And again, it's a good way to test it out and sort of say, like, okay, that seems to be doing what we need it to do, instead of reinventing the wheel.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say career pathing tools?
Yeah, so we have a company, for instance, that can sort of look at all the labor market information out there, take someone's resume, sort of say, like, here's where you're at in terms of the kinds of competencies you have. Here are some, like, 5 pathways that maybe you hadn't actually considered for yourself. Here are the attribute gaps. Here are the ways in which you can fill them, right? That, like, you need ways in which you can sort of say, like, here are the competencies you have now. Here are the competencies you need in order to be successful in these 5 or 10 pathways. You know, you're 30% of the way there, you're 60% of the way there. There's a lot of companies doing that kind of work in this space. And then there are others that say they're doing it, but it's not quite there. So that's where I think a challenge grant program would be really helpful. Is to
Are you talking about TORC?
No.
There is do you know about TORC?
No.
There is a program Chris introduced called TORC that does this. It takes your current skills and gives you a score about how far away you, say you're a cook and you want to become a MD.
Yeah.
It'll give you a score that tells you what you have to do to get there versus say you are a nurse and you want to become a doctor, it'll give you a score.
Right.
And that.
There's a bunch of different things.
I think in some ways Michelle is suggesting a separate category of challenge grant. That, you know, these are regional good, and that these will serve the purpose of getting some regional employers another dialogue going with local education skills providers, which we want to cultivate. But there are some challenge grants that reside almost at the level of the state. And I think that's what she was just illustrating, that we'd love to catalyze somebody who could look at the data architecture in Massachusetts, the assets here, and and be innovative in terms of pulling in some tools, whether it's TORC or anything. And
yeah, the guts that make into the running of individual programs effective, and also the guts that develop an idea of a system.
Yeah, and what
as
you
opposed
see,
to a collection of
what you see in
individual
lots of states, and you definitely see across states, is that good practices reside kind of locally or regionally, and for some reason they just don't. They don't start propagating and getting. And some of it is there's sometimes just a secret sauce of the right employer, the right head of a school district. So once again, going back to Colorado, if you look. Denver Public Schools, it's 3 consecutive heads that are pretty forward-looking and trying to make it happen.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, some of it's idiosyncratic, but a lot of it is we just keep reinventing the wheel.
Right.
And subscale, badly designed.
And not to beat a dead horse, that's what I thought this platform was going to be, right? An API-driven thing, right? API, it's a technical equivalent of a handshake, right? It's how you exchange data. But this thing sits in the middle, and these various tools, whether it's the scoring or the other one, they're essentially sharing information. And think about one of the things that we've discussed briefly is the opportunity of providing online training, for example, and this marketplace, etc. That should all be the idea of having to build an entire system like this from scratch. We're talking about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. There's no need for that. You could spend relatively small money and just provide a web presence and then hook into a whole bunch of other existing platforms. Maybe we have to choose which platforms we're going to work with, whether it's yours or the ones that Michelle was talking about, or another one that maybe somebody else brings to the table. But
can I just pick up on that? I have it because I sit on the board of edX. It is open source. It is local. It's a non-profit. You could imagine, I was very moved by my Uber driver, who's an Asian immigrant, and he said, "You're a professor, tell me what I should study," and I have no idea. But
how's he liking RFIDs?
So a really wonderful guy, I'm going to call him later, but imagine if you could go into a system, you could say, this is I'm a music teacher, I play music in my church, I teach music, I'm 46 years old. He says, I don't want to go into healthcare because I'm too old, I've been told. Can I learn programming? I'm like, dude, don't go there either, right? But what should I take? Okay, here's your daily dose, here's your X courses, right, or whatever, Western governance courses. Here are some companies that are backing this. Here's a curriculum you can take. Here are some apprenticeships you can apply for. I feel like that's got to be, it's difficult, it's a little bit space age, but I don't think we're that far from that. And the infrastructure is there. That exactly as Randy said.
Yeah, that's where exactly it is.
Following on this conversation, and Oz, not to put you on the spot, but sometimes I think the best way to prepare a grant program is to imagine what you think the outcome will be, and then see if it builds. So I always thought of healthcare when I think of those three industries. Healthcare is the most organized. It's the most credentialed. It's like the most sometimes bureaucratized. As we see by question 1 on the ballot coming up. But so it's miles above manufacturing training for what it has already on the books. But it's also, it is life and death. It's very, very critical skills that people have to have. And they have to really, not that manufacturing isn't, because you're getting in an airplane that somebody built the engine for, so you got to make sure it's going to fly. So if you're looking at this, maybe you might not be able to come up the top of your head, but what sort of proposals should come in from the education and workforce systems side that would meet your needs right now in healthcare?
It's a good question, and there's some very superficial responses that we're embedded in it right now. So we're working with a community college. Their question to us, give me what you really want for an outcome, and we'll build it into that, because they want to be successful. They don't want to just educate for the sake of having a certification. So we do have some of those fundamental formats and boilerplates, and it's because of your point, we're so highly regulated that, for example, on an annual basis, you have to not only perform your job, but you have to make sure you've met all these criteria. And if you don't, then you're on hold. So, we have, our workforce development folks have platforms to really share. Our hiring managers sort of are visionaries in terms of what they're doing in terms of technology. I do see healthcare as STEM. Telemedicine and technology is changing how we're going to take care of patients, and right before our eyes. So I think it's really pretty much in front of us. So when you look at a grant, you look at the pool of candidates that are available to us, or the lack of, and how we need to grow our own. And then how do we really make sure that we upskill to meet the needs of the regulations. And everyone's embedded in this. It's not just an HR workforce development, it's the hiring managers, the executive director, and much more so over the last few years. I have to say that HR, human resources, more like a subset in terms of workforce development. Now they're at the table because there's such a crying need, which is exciting for me and sort of the role I have. So I think it's a really good question. I would be more specific in a response just by pulling together some information to maybe 3 or 4 things that you'd like to see out of it. There are folks that look at grants, there are folks that go out for RFPs within our own system. So,
JD?
Yes.
We asked a little bit earlier if there are certain examples. I've done some work in this healthcare space from higher ed and intersection with workforce. I don't want to suggest that any of that is the model, but I've learned a few things and I'm hearing certain themes here. I think we as a group need to think about stratas, layers of this problem. So at one level, what I'm hearing is a conversation about grant making that I would describe as tactical, and with doing that, I have the train grant out right at the moment. I've done nursing grants in the past, and they very often are engaging specific employers in community colleges and other agencies into delivering training to a set number of individuals, getting them to work. In the nursing space, I did lead a coalition for a number of years. We ultimately got a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It was focused on a different conversation around workforce development. That was largely about the transformation of nursing, and as employers were requiring baccalaureate-prepared nurses, we're still preparing associate degree prepared nurses. Where was the skills gap, and what ultimately became a real focus on this RN to BSN program, focusing on the incumbent nurses and getting them to move on to baccalaureate level training programs. So it was a bit more of a strategic view of the workforce pipeline and system. And then I heard other conversations about what are we doing in our career centers, one-stop centers with sort of manual processes of face-to-face with a person and figuring out what skills they have and how do we map them to something, versus the opportunity of technology to be able to really do some of that, and how might we envision a platform that could really automate and bring some of those kinds of things to scale. That might be yet another whole level of grant making, and maybe that, Michelle, goes to that sort of challenge grant where we could really articulate, here's what we do it manually today, we have a big need, and we can't possibly scale it with the way we're doing it, but how might we learn from that and instantiate that in a platform that people, either individuals, many individuals hopefully will take advantage of directly, and or maybe some people will go to their one-stop, but it becomes the one-stop that is the user of the technology, provides that interface for the people who aren't quite ready to do it from their home in their slippers and engage this platform. So I just think there are layers to this conversation, and I worry as I listen to it that at any given moment we could latch on to the notion of a grant-making function, and we could go right down into the stuff that I'm doing right now with train grants and 50 people here and 25 people there. It's important, but it's not scale. I think there are other strategic transitions that are happening in industries. We need to recognize, where is the workforce going, and that isn't always seen by the frontline employer who's trying to fill a job next week. So that was the experience I had with the Mass Action Coalition and the Nursing and Allied Health Initiative that I led, and the work with Robert Wood Johnson, really focusing on this transition of nursing is going from associate degree to baccalaureate, and how do we engage the incumbent workforce and get them to come back to school at age 30, 40, 50, and get them to recognize that they really needed a baccalaureate degree. So that was a different level, and then this technology platform, I think, is a whole level again.
Thank you very much for that, and you've captured beautifully the way in which our discourse is toggling between the near-term issues and the deeper issues that are necessarily involved in building out a system. To expand on that, I would say the following. I think there's space for us to take some of this and capture it in some way. There's space to capture, deeper issues that we'll have to confront at some point. I think what we would do well for in serving our mission for the governor is to give him something he can do now. So let's think about timing for just a little bit. Let's assume that he proposed a challenge grant program in his FY20 budget, and the legislature approved that. The soonest that would become available would be the late summer, and then you'd have to go about, doing all the steps to have a challenge grant process and begin to design and organize and ultimately run new programs and have something to show for it before the end of a second term, right? So that's in a very real way is the game, part of the game that we're playing here. With that in mind, there's a need to focus on that as an imperative in what we say in this report, while also giving a due nod to these larger issues. The secretaries asked me, so we need a graphic, JD. We need a graphic. Here's the graphic that we've sort of come up with to describe, what we hope to achieve, let's say in the next several years, if we actually were able to do the things that we say we want to do. So again, and the funny thing, right, is that you've got this concept of an enabler and challenge grants, but you're not moving sequentially. You're building both at the same time. But you've got this enabler that's speaking to the big picture. Then you've got this more short-term tactical thing of challenge grants. And 6 is a random number, but here's how it could play out. Think of each box as representing a specific program that would be developed in a particular region. So you might have initiative number 1 that comes out of the challenge grant program that's focused on a CNA population, either training them for or taking CNAs and upskilling them to the next level. That would engage employer number 1 and then consortium number 1 of a post-secondary education or training provider, relevant community partners like student support providers, et cetera, and then go down the line. We pick these jobs because these are all examples of actual jobs that came to the fore in the regional skills plans. And so in a year, let's say, within a year, you would award challenge grants to do this. Between years 1 and 2, you would actually launch it, and then you begin to learn something about what works, and you begin to scale it up a little bit. And that's what you can maybe reasonably get to in the short term. I don't know if it looks like a lot or not much at all.
Well, you're building talent pipelines there, and what you're doing, which I think might be a theme that might come out a little bit more in the final draft, is we're trying to get demand pull more into the system. Mm-hmm. The historical system is kind of a supply push system, and this is a very tangible manifestation of. I agree entirely that sometimes employers are preoccupied with all I need is someone to do this tomorrow as soon as possible, but on the whole, they're going to be more aware of where things are arcing, particularly larger employers than not. So I think that's quite good. I'd love to see an equivalent initiative in trying to catalyze work-based learning experiments. And maybe that'll be embedded in some of these, but
I would require it to be embedded.
Well, it almost certainly will be, right?
Right.
But as opposed to a regional specific employer, a broader thing that encouraged
I have to
employers
react,
to
but I
consider
feel like we're doing this right now.
doing that.
A lot of it.
I've got the train grant. You know about this.
Mm-hmm.
You're a recipient. We put it out to all the community colleges. We have 13 of the 15 community colleges engaged. We're receiving grants. They're working with their one-stops and regional employers. Joanna's group is.
How much of it is digital?
None.
That's the key difference.
Yes.
So that's put that
there
on
you
the
go.
chart.
Exactly.
You have to put that there.
And that's the point, is that let's be careful about doing this work, because I think other people are doing this work. What we need to ask is, how can we look at the work that's being done, and what can we learn from that, and say, how would that inform some other platform that would do it better, faster, cheaper, or digital, right? If we could figure out how to take the current model and move it to a next generation, now we're adding something. Otherwise, I suggest
It's
we're
both
doing
the next
what other
generation
people are
technology,
doing
but
right
what
now.
about an older generation worker? How much
I'm sorry,
how much of what you're doing now is targeted to school-aged people as opposed to mid-career?
Mine is adults, entirely.
Is it all adults?
All
Okay.
adults.
And older adults.
Older
Not 20,
adults.
we're not talking 24. It's a lot, 24 is probably the younger. Of
Great.
It's mostly, I say, in my realm, it's a lot of people in their mid to 30s to 40s that are displaced,
Yep.
have some issues, need some retraining, dislocated workers. But you said something very interesting, and you hit it right on the head, is that we always have to look at how we're going to do things with less money, right? This model, right, that we're constantly looking at is how we're going to do it with less money and and scale it, but faster. And it's always like, and the next time around, it's like, okay, so we have less money this time, and we have to add more people. How are we going to do this? And that's where the digital part comes in.
Yeah.
But not every aspect of training can be online. So for healthcare, and I'm very ignorant when it comes to healthcare,
Or
but
machining,
like,
or machining.
well, I'm just using, because we're all, I mean, I could talk about machining all day. But for me, like, I can do virtual welding, but there comes a point when I'm going to actually have to lay a bead.
No, it's similar.
But so it's very similar to healthcare. So it's, we want to do a lot of, because it's cheaper for training providers also to do things in a digital platform, but you still have that piece that they're going to have to come out and do physical stuff at locations to get that. But
Let's just
the
make it up.
wraparound services, and I wanted to say before, you're 1,000% right about the wraparound services, and that seems to be where the cuts happen, which doesn't allow people to have access to this. So that's the kind of the first piece that kind of gets hit when we have, and I'm not saying anything about, we understand the market of the dollars that we have to work with, right? So that's kind of the kind of gray area that I'm kind of stressing about for this long term.
So that's a really good example. I can visualize what you're describing in healthcare in particular. There's classroom instruction, there's digital training, and then there's the simulation lab where you're actually working with the patient in a room or some sort of dummy, for lack of a better term, that you can take the vitals, you can do everything on this, tool. And it's very much so. And in the precepting is really where I think the cost comes in after a while, really.
But let me just take us back to the underlying hypothesis of this whole effort, which is not that we are trying to do something here that is the solution to every problem. Rather, our hypothesis is that that tightly employer co-designed, digitally enabled, competency-based programs can be a significant part of addressing education and workforce needs in a way that is better, more effective, less expensive, and for learners and helps them in their careers, and also helps employers as well. It's not meant to be a solution to everything. So maybe one way to think about your question, Joanna, is that in scoping, or your very good point, right? Is that in scoping this challenge grant program, maybe we are explicitly not going to solicit ideas that require a major sort of practicum component. The other threshold question that we really have to deal with here is, and which is why we have a challenge grant program that opens the door wide for anybody to put up their best idea, is that at the end of the day, I don't think we know who can do this work. I personally don't know. I mean, I know one thing, which is that Southern New Hampshire University ran a program like the one we're talking about with Partners Healthcare, and it was pretty good. It had 70% completion, which is pretty good in the context of the zone that we're talking about here. And I do not know, I want to know, who else of you around the table is able to do that. I know that you want to do it over at Holyoke Community College, but I don't know. Will your faculty cooperate? What are your online capabilities? Will you have employers close to you who will agree to do this? Don, I want to know from you, but you're not in that business currently. So how does that work? And with edX, all down the line, you asked that question. So, we have to go back to our working hypothesis and just make sure that we address that question of both encouraging and determining who can do this work at a larger scale. And we're trying to set this up in a way that where we can encourage and guide and promote the ability of lots of players around this table and some who are not represented to say, yes, we want to do this and we can do it, and here's how.
So my worry about something like this is, and I think I've voiced this before, that it is so narrow, and I understand the need for like a win and like a near-term sort of victory, and also just to like be able to prove that this thing works. But again, to this point, a lot of these things exist. I do think the idea of, so in this discussion about wraparound services, in-person, hybrid versus online, an ecosystem enabler and a platform play does not prohibit the use of in-person wraparound services. It's an enabler and a challenge grant program to step out and say who are going to come together and actually make this ecosystem play work at in a scalable manner beyond just what College for America can do. It's a one-off. It doesn't scale, right? Like they're not. It's a great program, but there's a reason why it's not catching on. Like something isn't scalable about it, right? And so what can we do to create like a prize, like a dangle prize, so that it forces people and incentivizes them to actually work together and build that ecosystem and build that platform and build in the right kinds of wraparound services that don't just end when you get into a job but consistently follow you, right? And like those are the things that we kind of need to figure out. And then we don't have to also be stuck in just healthcare. I think healthcare is critical, but we could do all three. We don't have to just do healthcare. We could do IT and manufacturing.
Yeah. To Michelle's point, one of the strange things about College for Merit and similar programs is that you put these programs in place in companies, and they just don't get the uptake that you expect for some reason. And so there's something missing there around. I mean, the programs are geared towards working adults or frontline workers. They're funded properly, but the enrollments just don't actually add up.
Yeah, I think part of that is it's not linked enough to the performance management system and to the where's the carrot for the worker.
Exactly.
You've got this benefit if you want to work another 20 hours a week on your own time. We'll support you, which is a nice offer,
Right.
but you can get very minimal uptake.
So point being, if you build it, they may not come.
Right, yeah.
Michael?
So, doesn't look that narrow to me. Just so sorry if I'm in the minority on that. It actually looks pretty like a large undertaking, just my gut. To amplify some of the things that are being said, I think that, I've always looked at education challenges, and I've never seen one where I couldn't find people who were doing a lot of the things that might solve the challenge. So that doesn't mean as much to me personally, although of course we have to be open-minded to a lot of the other things that are going on. That said, as I'm thinking about this, and people, mention competency-based education and certifications, I mean, has there been any thought on the other end, and Oz, you could probably weigh in on this, I mean, is pre-employment testing important? Is there, you had mentioned some of the practical aspects of what's being learned, because to me, they're complementary, right? If you're going to, if I'm going to be the person who is getting those skills, are those skills then interesting to you as the employer for those jobs? And then who's actually doing that? Because I don't know how prevalent that is within healthcare today.
We're partnering with organizations that are doing some of that already for the community, and for example, JVS, so they're part of our pipeline partner in a lot of this work. They're similar. Rainier is running an organization as well through Advocate. So there are different buckets that are doing this really well, and they're partners with us so they know our needs. But we don't do it internally.
Not internally. But I think the how is what's going to make this not narrow, is my point. There's a lot here, and if we actually want to not just get a quick win, because I don't know how quick this really is, but to get a win, I think there are a lot of pieces of this that need to be further explored.
What do you mean by, what level of screening are you talking about?
I just mean that competency-based education, if
Like
I...
a math test?
Possibly,
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
Anything, because it's really, I have some experience in competency-based education, and if you learn, so I pass it, I get the certification for it, whatever it, that doesn't mean that it works perfectly for what you need. And so I think there's two ends to where this probably has to go, and we've been talking a lot about the front end because that's sort of the part that's in the news right now, right, with the edXs and the Western governors and others. But there's the other end as to how that is being interpreted and whether it's useful.
So,
Sorry.
I was gonna say, look, I think the reason I really like the idea of a challenge grant strategy, even though I think some of the issues that have been brought up and, David and other people talking about experience with other grants, I mean, we all know there's some limits to them. But I like the way you summarized it, JD. I mean, it seems to me, when I've heard the governor talk about this, he talked, because I love quoting him because I think he thinks about it at the right sort of at one level, high level. We've got a large, complicated, dense infrastructure of both education entities and a less well-funded, less dense infrastructure, but real one of workforce support entities. And yet we have this reality of a large population that isn't accessing the jobs that provide the significant sort of compensation and opportunity, and a large number of employers saying they have open spots, which is a deep, and profound sort of market mismatch and loss for a lot of people. And I agree with Don that, as far as I can tell, with a lot of these cases, the uptakes aren't what people have thought historically. So there's some ingredients missing, and we're all kind of blind men in the elephant. We have different experiences, so we say, in my company or in this project, or, right? And so how could a state take a more comprehensive approach? One of the approaches would be to say, we don't know what solutions work, be humble about it. So not say, we're gonna design the solution and try to impose it. I mean, that's sort of like, we're gonna figure it out, even though lots of smart people have been trying in lots of places. And this problem is a widespread problem. It's not just a Massachusetts problem. We probably have the high-class version of it. Many states don't even have the good job openings and so on, right? Don't have our level of college education, so we're the high-class end of the problem, and it's a big problem, right? So I think assuming we don't know that, and I think thinking about what would be some of the critical elements in that, to me, one of the challenges for your report is, what do you put in the report that's been decided, and then what gets decided later? To me, sustainability, scale orientation, and deep employer and provider cross commitments, right? Because I think that's what we're sort of all reaching at here. And your role model, I agree with you, part of what got me excited about all of this work and was a feature of that governor's convening that we held at MIT. One of them was, the Partners Project. Another was, the MicroMasters, and that person who got up and said, I'm going to work at this bio, because it's not just the people who are, lost their jobs and all that. It was a woman working at a biotech company who was stuck in one job and was able to jump to another job in supply chain management, right? So we have a taste that there's these things out there, but let's be honest, none of them are vaguely at the scale, or even sustainability, to change the needle. So, I think this idea of a grant program, a challenge grant program, that is pretty careful about what it defines as how they'll be scored, might get more people. It might get, you say, I don't know what you're gonna do, Don. It might get Don to apply, and he might do it with Christina, or he might not, and he might do it, with Oz and Red. I mean, you're just trying to say, look, let's shape where people are heading. And I know and I understand that's what you're saying, Dave, right? But this is another broader play at that. I think it would have to be complementary, but, So I just, what I like about the idea is you could, just if we think as a group, what else could you have said? You could have said, we're gonna design the system and set a new set of specifications that we're gonna, this is what we did in early college and between higher ed and K-12, that's gonna determine whether you get a designation. So you're gonna be a designated lifelong learning provider. We're gonna have 42 pages of application, and by the way, maybe no money behind it, right? I don't think that would be as good an approach, right? So here, I think if we could get some dough, and say, we're not sure what'll work. In fact, like NIH grants, we expect a fair amount of it to fail. But if a few of them succeed and really catalyze sustainable, big uptake, and we picked one industry because it's knowable, it's everywhere in the state, I think that's kind of, I think that is about the right size of problem to bite off, which is not every employee in Massachusetts in every industry, but it's one area where we have the potential. I don't know.
Could I just add one quick thought to that? And in the design of these things, they give us opportunities to address some of the very good points that have been made. For example, maybe having a clear but rather loose design around challenge grants gives players an opportunity to put up ideas that get to the question of why College for America hasn't scaled so far. I mean, and I would say, looking at that, right, good completion rates, decent scale, but not, truly impressive scale, right? So there is a zone in the further articulation of this where we can get to some of the questions that have been laid at the table. And then there's also a place where we both ideate at the enabler level, right? Continue to think about some of these questions for the medium and long terms. Learn from the set of grantees that we make, and have an exchange between those two sides. And that is very much in keeping with time-tested approaches that we've used here at Commonwealth Corporation in the training programs that we do, communities of practice and that sort of thing. And we kind of need that, when the reality is that we are still at a threshold moment of not knowing who really can do this work.
So the enabler is going to be a very active observer of this process.
I would imagine
I hope so.
I would imagine.
So my concern with I think you're right on the money, but however, we have to take it a step further, because for this report to go out and then leave it for the interpretation and eventual implementation of folks that may be thinking about this in terms of the way that it's always been done, we lose now control. And where am I going with that? For example, I don't think that an education provider should be able to submit a grant without partnering with an employer in a joint grant proposal, not a letter of support, but a joint grant proposal where these two entities are going to be able to apply. The point that Michael was making is right on the money. His question was simple. How do you make sure that the training aligns with the employer needs? The program that Oz was referencing that we're working on, it's a cybersecurity program. Well, why is it relevant? Why do we know what they need? Well, we have hackers that are doing consulting during the day for companies like Partners and others. And those same hackers are then teaching a class at night. Whereas when you have an education provider who has been outside of industry for years, and I think that going out and talking to employers is not enough. And when you don't have that strong alignment between what's being taught in the classroom and what's happening in private industry, we're just going to end up in the same place. And there's nothing that I've seen that boxes that as a requirement to submit a grant as an evaluation criteria.
So two quick thoughts. This stuff that we've had, recommendation 3, right, these touch points, seems to get at a lot of that. If you begin to think of these as required components of a grant program.
I know, but my point is that if you don't spell out specific things in your recommendations, for example, co-design of programs by employers and content providers. There's a million and one ways that can be expanded, if you will.
All right, so get specific about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very quick comment on just on the previous recommendation. I do want to come back to Michelle's suggestion. There are grants, which is great. We should do grants, but I still think we should think about prices, because there are people who will not apply to grants, but who have good success, maybe funded by foundations, etc., etc. And I do think having an enterprise-like concept is where you're rewarding past success and also recognizing everything before.
Can you go back to
I just wanted to comment on Chris's comments, which I thought were very insightful when we're thinking about scale. And, to Don's point about, we can't adopt an attitude that if you build it, they will come type of thing. But I would encourage us, and maybe the place is recommendation 4, but I think that part of the problem that we have is our own creation because of how things are funded in the Commonwealth. We don't have a funding structure that enables scalability. The grants are random at times. They're oriented towards your community. I don't know of any ones that don't have partners. Now, all of the grants that we do always have partners at the table, but I do think that there's maybe an opportunity in here to think about a reorganization of the funding to enable scalability and more comprehensive adaptation of something, particularly around a few areas that we want to really brand the Commonwealth in a greater way. While certainly it requires more money. I mean, that's part of the challenge with scalability. But I think part of that is the structure of how we distribute dollars, the cycle of it, and their approach to it.
Thank you. One last comment, and then we should really move on to policy.
Sorry, can you go back to the visualization? One of the things I think I keep struggling with as we think about this ecosystem enabler idea is that I think what we're talking about with the back end entity is really that council, right? It's not really an ecosystem enabler. It's a council kind of building these things, and then the next layer are the challenge grants to the enablers. So I think what we're trying to articulate, right, is that we need to create. So the thing about an X Prize, right, is you can't get any of the money unless you prove like that you can actually create an aircraft that will do a suborbital flight, land, and then within a week do it again safely, right? You have to prove you can do these things. And I think the way that we conceive of this sort of ecosystem enabler is it's not just people saying they're going to come to work together like Rainier is worried about, right? It's actually, no, they've actually created this thing that has the career pathing tool, that has a lot of the pieces in this enabler. I think it's actually, that can actually be proven through the grant making process, is that they're able to sort of take data, real-time data, leverage it. They're able to integrate the employers. And that's where I think if we narrow on healthcare only, there actually may be an ecosystem play that an IT group builds with employers, with learning providers, with whatever, or a manufacturing group that does it, versus sort of just constraining the pot there. So I think that's where I'm struggling with the conversation, is I think a couple of us keep kind of pointing to it's actually the challenge grant that's not going directly into those 6, but it's going into that ecosystem play that we're trying to prove works, and that can show scale, that can show good outcomes.
Well, manufacturing already does it though. We already have solid in the EOHED grants. I don't know if he's here that's familiar with them, but we have like almost 90% placement ratings in these programs. I mean, because the employers are already at the table, and NAMC has the community, so it's already.
Why don't we just give you more money? I mean,
No, not me.
No, I'm serious, but
No,
to
not
your
me.
group.
But that's the statewide. But that took years to formulate, and a lot of hard work in Mass High. Is it Mass Higher? Your groups,
Chris
here, like
and
the way that the
Yes, yeah.
workforce investment boards all kind of came together and really, they solidified it. But the employers, the reason why I think it was successful, because they were so desperate for people that they had no choice but to integrate and like try to, bring it together.
So would it be a disservice to the Commonwealth citizens if you have you still have a gap of, I don't know, 5,000 jobs, just leave the number. I know nothing about your industry, but let's say it's 5,000 jobs. If you have a gap of 5,000 jobs, shouldn't we say, well, that thing is already built. This one's easy. Let's just maximize that. Here's the X amount of dollars that you need. Here, continue to scale that, and we'll continue to explore what we need to explore with healthcare and then with IT.
But how well does the thing you're talking about deal with the lifelong learning issue of having career transitions built in, where you're doing that career pathing work, where it is digitally enabled, where you do have wraparound services, those sorts of things?
I think the what we've done this year that has made it more of a lifelong learning effort is moved into apprenticeships with the companies. So now the companies are looking at their employees saying, I have gaps at a higher level than the entry-level positions that you're coming in doing, and now we're going to do apprenticeship programs. And that to me, and I wasn't always a believer in apprenticeships, but the past year or two, I've totally seen how they make a huge difference in the companies themselves and in the workers. So that it's the apprenticeship model that is building that lifelong learning. And the people in the companies, because they have the support of their employer, are jumping on it and saying, oh, I can do that. My boss wants me to do that. Now I can do that. So it is a good model for that. The challenge is obviously the money flow into it, and we have talked a million times about how to make these programs credit worthy, so that people can apply for financial aid to the colleges and the tech schools to make them stay. Now that's the tricky part that we're in right now.
And the digital piece.
And the digital piece, there's some parts of this is digitalized, like Tooling U and those sorts of tools that we use. But most of it has been in a traditional classroom in the tech schools or the community colleges.
The companies have money to fund this too. That's the other thing. You need to, if you build it, they come. Verizon spends what, $93 million a year on tuition assistance. There's $18 billion spent across the country on just tuition assistance. That doesn't include the training budgets that are out there. So when you're able to actually organize around something that appears to be strategic to corporations, they will then begin to pool money and spend it in a different way than just saying, hey, this is kind of the recruitment benefit we just set out there for anybody to get into.
And certainly partners, put skin in the game around its program, and that in itself may be a required design element of something. We have less than 20 minutes left and some important material to go over. But I thank you for this. You've given the team and I a lot to think about in terms of how to integrate this. I'll say candidly, I think some pieces of this ship have sailed in terms of the desire to focus on healthcare. But I'm really intrigued by the discussion around the XPRIZE construct. And even if it's something that we would propose to do today or right away, there's something more that we all want to have here that's not yet captured. So
JD,
I hear
can I
that.
just ask? You have to design an XPRIZE just right, otherwise it fails. Point number one. But point number two is you can get off the ground very rapidly with the price, because you don't have to fund something and wait for 3 years or something.
And I would just comment that, to some of the points earlier brought up about underrepresented students, there's no mention about equity in here. I would perhaps suggest looking at the recent recommendations of the commissions, the Latino and the Black commissions, and maybe look at some intersection there, since that is a priority of the governor, and we haven't addressed that well in here.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. That's been a priority in our larger rewrite of some of the lead-up text, and now that those reports are submitted, we're going to draw from them. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay. So let me just touch on the recommendation 4, sources of funding for support, and walk you through some of the rationale behind these recommendations. So first off, the idea of utilizing the Workforce Competitiveness Trust Fund to potentially fund some of this work. I imagine not all of you are familiar with it, but it's a legislatively funded program, this year funded at $5 million, which provides grants to consortia of employers and training providers to upskill underemployed and long-term unemployed workers. And as you've already seen, significant elements of the design model for the intended challenge grant program are have been informed by the existing WCTF model. Commonwealth Corporation administers this program currently, and we have initiated a conversation with the administration around how to build in some of these concepts into the next RFP for the program. So what we've offered to the administration is an option that would allow for the future program grantees to put together proposals that were around digitally enabled competency-based approaches, in addition to the standard types of programs that are already funded. So this is not a wholesale reorientation of funding, but it is a lead into something that I think is probably advisable in the event that the governor proposes something and it's not something new, that is not funded by the legislature. This gives us a window to do something today rather than having to wait another year. And it's as simple as that. There's quite a lot of further discussion that has to happen with the administration around the development of that RFP and with longstanding partners who've been part of the program, workforce boards and employers and others. But the idea is to introduce a new option into the existing array of programmatic options for that.
Just quickly drop the point here relative to the current Washington administration, Department of Education trying to broaden the make Title IV more flexible.
Maybe it's in 5.
Was that in 5? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So there's a similar opportunity to think about the Workforce Training Fund and the ideas that we've discussed. So the Workforce Training Fund is a trust fund that employers pay into and that employers can apply to get grants from. This is another account that is managed on behalf of the state by Commonwealth Corporation. And, and we award grants of up to $250,000 a year to support training initiatives of incumbent workers of various types. From time to time, those are already digitally enabled, but you can see how that construct might lend itself to applicants who might do something broadly along the lines of what we're talking about here. We also, at Commonwealth Corporation, have been developing an online training marketplace. It's getting closer to a beta testing phase. I said it's in the beta testing phase in the draft. It's not quite there yet. But it's meant to be a portal for companies to shop for a broader array of trainers for their organizations. Because one of the facets of private training today is that companies will go to their local training provider. The market is not incredibly transparent or visible, and so this is meant to give them access to a broader set of people who might be good trainers for them. It's still in formation, but it has the capacity to evolve into something broader, such as a place where online training could be delivered.
Is that a custom platform, Jim?
It is a custom platform.
What language? Just one, only technical.
I don't know.
Okay.
Does anyone know what language? What's the?
Just trying to figure out how scalable it is. That's all.
Who's the company we're working with around this? Do you guys remember? Experfy. Yeah. If any of you familiar with that?
I'm guessing Esperanto.
Yeah. So again, we've included it here, and we've talked in broad terms with Secretary Acosta and others about the connection points. And so again, we want something to happen here, even if there is no new funding available. And so there's that. The community colleges have been working on a project to expand the ability of community college learners to get credit for prior learning. That is connected to this Mass Experience Counts portal that was funded by a federal grant and which currently exists. I don't think it hasn't been the money has run out, and so it exists, but the marketing hasn't happened around it, but it's there. And then 15 institutions and maybe even some of the state U's are part of this effort to figure out how to expand credit for prior learning schema in the state. Again, that could be broadly relevant to what we're after here. So we think it prudent to mention it and to signal the idea that should continue to be supported, especially when right now it's kind of just, what support is there is what you are able to, your institutions are able to put into it.
What about credit for employer-provided learning, like Walmart's doing?
Quite possibly. I don't know. You know the state of play of this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the legwork has been done on this, but, as JD said, in terms of execution, you need dollars, so there's some work that's still moving forward, but that overall infrastructure to make that happen in a bigger way needs some dollars.
Yeah.
But that, that would be included in that.
Great.
Yeah.
The next two are big, so we should have put a few more words on that next, but Mass Grant funds are available to students today, but making Mass Grant funds available to learners who participate in the types of programs that we're talking about, that is not part of the scheme today. And we think that perhaps we should offer that in the context of, what would you say, Chris? Slow-moving but meaningful efforts to advance a conversation about reform of the state student aid system?
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's very polite.
And with that in mind, there is this new pot of money which is very much still being worked out in terms of the implementation. It's called Match Grant Plus. It's specifically for community college students. And maybe along the lines of what you were pointing at earlier, Christina, I think that if we could get away from some of our rules around what's state supported and what's not state supported, which, around which decisions regarding aid are made, and allow community colleges who put up some programs of this type in the workforce side of their house to be able to use match grant funding for that, that would be good.
Yeah.
So there's a state financial aid conversation that we want to point to here in the policy recommendations. And then finally, this was an idea that Secretary Pizer had proposed of forgiving tuition and fee balances of students who return to public higher education institutions to pursue these types of programs. So a big problem for learners seeking to return to higher education today is that institutional rules prevent them from re-enrolling until they've paid off outstanding balances. And so the thinking is, what if the Commonwealth decided to eat the cost of that, at least as far as the public institutions go, so that learners who wanted to take advantage of these types of programs wouldn't have a barrier erected in front of them. So
all public institutions?
I think we put it in the report, all public institutions, including UMass. Now, obviously, the cost dimensions of that might be different, but maybe not.
It would be interesting to know what the cost would be.
But I will say though, honestly, I don't want to give. For me, the idea of giving away free things, if an employer is not willing to pay for it, then is it the right thing from a workforce development for us to be spending money on? Just
Well, I do want to point out, this is a regional difference, but Western Massachusetts is made up of primarily small and medium-sized businesses.
That's fair.
It's not Boston, and so there's just a lot of organizations that might have 5 to 15 employees. Yeah.
And that's in our area as well, especially manufacturing. I think the average machine shop, we're not all Raytheons and GEs, we're like 20 people. A lot of that support a lot of the local large businesses in the state as supplements to larger product lines.
JD, was there any discussion about free community college?
No.
I don't know, comment. So part of what strikes me about this, I think this is important in terms of repurposing and kind of reorganizing some of the funding streams that exist for the purposes of launching these ideas and getting. I don't know that necessarily if we were to hit it out of the park and have a huge success, I don't think any of these are necessarily going to grow because of the success of the program. And that's the problem in terms of counting on any of these to be able to carry this for the long term. These are all subject to all kinds of other exterior influences, including legislature, policy, state budget, all that stuff, right? So it's not going to necessarily, I don't think any of these pools are necessarily going to grow as a direct result of the success. However, what isn't here is this idea that's come up several times about the private sector's buy-in, and how do you engage and build products and demonstrate success that is going to get somebody excited about a private industry excited about contributing perhaps some of those gazillions of dollars that they do already spend on training directed in this direction. After if there's proof of the concept here that these things work. There's also a whole other line that may be controversial for now, but this idea that everybody gets everything for free, and where is the conversation about creating such a good project that individuals are willing to pay nominal fees into it. For equity, you certainly want to do sliding scale and all kinds of things like that. But this idea that it has to be free in order for it, and not respect the fact that people willing to move their own careers ahead will be willing to put some skin in the game too. As a way, it's not how you fund the big thing, but it should also be a component.
So your concern is the loss of the signaling
Yes.
either from the
Yes.
user or from the market, which is what you
On those both
Yes.
ends, yeah. We have heard several times about employer skin in the game, and that's not really called out, and we should call it out. And by the way,
Well, he means individuals.
no, I know, and I was just going to
It's both,
say,
it's both.
the Partners Program there was an individual cost to learners. In the sense, now a lot of it was paid for because it was structured so that they could use Title IV federal student aid. So oftentimes there was no net cost to learners. But the modeling of these programs did involve a contribution from the employer and at least a student aid contribution from the learners, often an actual contribution from the learner. So we, again, we in the limited time we've haven't been able to get to the level of cost modeling of individual hypothetical programs, in part because, again, I would say we still have to reach that threshold question of who is willing to do this and equipped to do this and will do it. But obviously, we should say a bit more about what cost modeling we envision.
And what could be explored.
Perhaps in recommendation 3, becomes not just about instructional model, but also a bit about cost modeling too.
Just quickly, the Commonwealth also passed a tax credit for companies who participate in apprenticeship programs that in IT, financial services, IT, healthcare, and advanced manufacturing. And they're writing the rules about that right now. But it's sort of a backwards way to pay for it that, motivates companies to get involved. It's $4,800, so it's not like a lot of money, but, we see it from the apprenticeship model as a way to really get companies involved in this. So any sort of tax policy that either for individuals, they should be able to also get a tax credit if they participate in education of this nature, and companies do as well. That might be another method.
Thank you.
Okay.
Michelle, and then we should wrap up.
Sorry, it might just also be worth socializing the idea of income share agreements here as another funding model, especially as we think about people returning repeatedly over their lifetimes to some sort of learning experience. The other piece that the final bullet on recommendation 4 made me think of is it may not be that the tuition fees are the pain point, but really, we don't offer any potential solution. And I'm kind of sad Joe left because he just wrote a whole paper on the care economy of caregiving, both for elderly and for kids. But that is as we think about this lifelong learner, that childcare piece is a huge barrier, huge pain point. And I think it may speak to this idea that it's less the tuition and fees bill, but it's this circumstantial barrier that prevents them from coming back.
Thank you. So, what can you expect from the team and I in the next couple of weeks? We are in the midst of a pretty substantial edit and augmentation of the drafts you've seen. And that just became even more complex given today's very good conversation. So thank you for that. But the goal is to, the secretaries have expressed a desire to see this submitted before Thanksgiving. And I think we can do it. I think we've got a critical mass of recommendations around which there is support. I'm grateful for all the comments and and enrichment that we had today. That nobody's had violent negative reactions to what you've seen, and I take that as a good thing. But I will just keep you posted over email, certainly, around where we are with text revisions, and we'll determine as needed, whether we need some kind of additional, call or something. Where we can reflect further on what's coming next. I'll say that in the prefatory text, nothing will be out of step with the general thrust of our discourse. we're just trying to work a lot harder to create clearer and better through lines with more effective graphics and backing information around the arguments that we've already made as to why we should do this. So the text may look very different, but the argumentation will be the same, but better stated. Any last questions before we break? All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
With the compliment, you keep moving this thing ahead.
Yeah.
Despite the rest of us.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
That's true.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was a nice solid draft.
We did, by the way.
Yeah, the early college
We
draft.
did put up.
Yes,
Let's
Yeah, that's
get into labor
what we
contract
fund.
issues,
Yeah, yeah.
and as well as the charter college.
Yeah. Well, and I could understand.
Yeah, so we've
this
got,
should document, perhaps as the policy folks get more,
It's got multiple high school
detail
sites.
that.
And I'm going up,
Because you know, the examples that you referenced are very different collective bargaining structures.
state, and the city state involved in the community practice we're building around early college.
Simply said.
So,
Yeah.
That's interesting because.
So anyway, you know, I think it's, it makes
Yep,
sense.
yep, they're in there too.
But
Yeah.
we are actually on November.
Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the
With
good.
Jay
Say
and
enough
Sam
against
State
it.
North Shore
Get
presenting
people
their
interested
early
and
college
excited and
model
building.
to the WIP.
Yeah, no, there's a
We
lot
know
of great
about it,
stuff
and
in
Ed
there,
knows
and
about
certainly
it.
a lot that,
Esoterically.
a lot of
We
long
wanted them
for
to
that
get
we
their
are
ground
moving forward,
control.
so.
Thank you for
it's-
being so supportive of what we're trying to do.
Well, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah,
it's
no,
got,
this is
you know,
great.
whole
I mean,
pathways
I,
development.
Yes.
We needed something like
Oh,
this.
you're gonna link in work-based
Elevate
learning.